If this story kept you up tonight, you're exactly who the Nightmare Zoo was built for. We're closing in on 1,000 subscribers before the end of July, and every sub helps us bring you darker stories, better production, and more nightmares to come. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and become part of the zoo. See you in the dark. It followed the Blood Alaska Wendigo attack story. The temperature gauge on Danny Okonek's truck had stopped meaning anything around 40 below, back when the numbers became academic, and the real measurement was how long skin could stay exposed before it started to die. 41 degrees below zero, and the four of them, Danny, his brother Cole, and the two Anderson boys, Pete and Marcus, were 11 miles from the nearest plowed road, dragging a moose carcass through snow that came up to their knees. They'd field-dressed the bull an hour before dusk. That had been their first mistake. "We should have gutted it closer to the truck," Marcus said, his headlamp cutting a cone of white through the dark spruce. His breath came out in ragged clouds that froze instantly to the fur ruff of his hood. "Too late now," Cole said. He hauled on the rope lashed around the moose's back legs, muscles screaming. The animal's intestines had been left steaming in the snow a quarter-mile back, a dark wet stain already crusting over with frost, and none of them wanted to think too hard about what that smell might carry through the black timber. That's when they heard it. Not a howl, not a growl. A sound like a man trying to scream through a throat that had forgotten how. A low, wet, keening moan that rose and fell across the ridge above them and seemed to come from every direction at once. "Wolves," Pete said, too fast, the word tumbling out like he needed to believe it. Danny didn't answer. He'd grown up in Nulato, had heard his grandmother's stories about the thing that used to be a man, the thing that ate and never filled the hole inside it, the thing whose ribs showed through skin, stretched like old leather, because starvation was its natural state, no matter how much it consumed. He'd laughed at those stories around a campfire 100 times. He wasn't laughing now. They dropped the rope and ran for the truck. The forest answered their footsteps with its own, a rhythm too long-legged to be human, crashing through deadfall with a speed that didn't match the size of the thing making the noise, closing distance in strides that ate 40 feet at a time. Marcus went down first, his snowshoe catching on a buried root, and by the time Pete turned back to help him, something had already dropped from the black canopy above. It didn't so much attack as arrive. 1 second Marcus was scrambling upright, cursing, reaching for Pete's outstretched hand. The next, a shape vast and skeletal and wrong folded itself around him like a hand closing over an insect. Pete would spend the rest of his life, which turned out to be about 4 more minutes, trying to understand what he'd seen. Antlers, yes, but growing wrong, twisted back into the skull as if the bone itself had panicked while forming. Skin the gray-yellow of old tallow, stretched so tight over a rib cage, the size of a boat hull, that every breath showed the shape of the lungs beneath. A mouth that unhinged too far, packed with teeth that had grown in overlapping rows like a shark's, all crowded forward as though the jaw could no longer hold them. Marcus didn't scream so much as make a sound like a hinge tearing loose. The thing's arm? Too many joints. Elbow after elbow, drove down and through him, not around, and lifted him off the snow with his own spine cradled in its palm. Spine still connected to a body that had simply stopped being a coherent shape. Steam rolled off the wound in the cold air, and for one unbearable second, Marcus's eyes were still open, still looking at Pete, still trying to ask a question that had no words left to carry it. Then the thing's jaw closed around his skull with a sound like a boot crunching through lake ice. And that was the end of the question. Pete ran. He didn't remember deciding to. His body simply reversed itself and fled, snowshoes forgotten, sinking to his thighs with every stride, screaming Danny's name into a forest that swallowed the sound whole. Behind him, he heard the wet tearing noises of something feeding with the frantic. joyless speed of an animal that had never once in its endless existence eaten enough to satisfy anything. He didn't hear it catch up to him. That was the worst part. One moment there was 40 feet of snow between him and the sound of feeding, and the next moment something closed around his ankle from below, from beneath the snow, as though the thing had tunneled under the crust like a snake through sand and yanked him down onto his face. Cole found what was left of both of them 11 minutes later, guided by Pete's last scream, which had gone on for longer than a human throat should have been able to sustain a single note. He would never describe to anyone what he saw in that clearing. The state troopers who eventually retrieved the remains used the word predation, animal unclassified, on the report, and left it there, because there was no box on the form for what they were actually looking at. 2 bodies opened along lines too clean to be claws, and too ragged to be knives, hollowed with a thoroughness that suggested the thing responsible had eaten with the desperate, cavernous hunger of something that had been starving since before the last ice age, and would go on starving forever, because that was the entire shape of its curse. Not appetite, absence. A hole with teeth. Danny and Cole didn't run for the truck. Running was for people who still believed distance meant safety. Instead, Danny remembered, from his grandmother's voice, thin and urgent across 40 years of memory, that the thing hated fire the way a starving man hates the smell of food he can't have, and that it could be tricked, because underneath the ruin of its body there was still something that had once, a very long time ago, been a person, and persons could be reasoned with, however faintly, however far down that reason had been buried. They didn't outrun it. They climbed a half-dead spruce with a lighter and a can of bar and chain oil from the truck bed, and when the smell of them brought it crashing into the clearing below, 9 feet of gray hide and wrong angles, and a face that kept trying to remember how to be a face, Danny poured the oil down through the branches and dropped the lighter after it. The thing didn't scream like the movies promised. It made a sound like a held breath finally released, low and almost grateful, as the flames climbed the frozen tallow of its hide, and the antlers blackened, and the too many joints folded in on themselves, one at a time, collapsing not in agony, but in something that looked, from 30 feet up in a burning tree, unsettlingly close to relief. By the time the flames died to embers hissing in the snow, there was nothing left to identify as ever having been a man, and nothing left to identify as ever having been anything else either. Danny and Cole waited until dawn to climb down. They never went back for the moose. Word got around Nulato, the way it always does, that the Okonek brothers had lost 2 hunting buddies to a bear attack out past the ridge, and everyone nodded and said how sorry they were, and no one, not one person in that town, asked why Danny. Okonek kept a can of bar and chain oil and a lighter in every vehicle he owned for the rest of his life, or why he never, ever hunted again once the winter dark came down.